Ornamentation. Most musicians who play pitched instruments think about ornamentation as grace notes, trills, mordents, and all those other funny-looking symbols from the Baroque era. As a percussionist, it's important to learn all of those guidelines because we very frequently perform transcriptions of music from that era as well as run into these concepts in modern music on our keyboard instruments. For percussionists, though, there's an extra layer: ornamentation for unpitched instruments like the snare drum. Most commonly, these ornaments consist of some number of grace notes followed by a louder primary note. I divide the frequently encountered ornaments for snare drum into 4 categories by the number of grace notes required. A flam has 1 grace note, a drag has 2 grace notes, the 4-stroke ruff has 3 grace notes, and longer ornaments have more than 3 grace notes. The length of these ornaments also corresponds to how commonly each will be encountered. As a side note, some percussionists consider rolls, especially double-stroke rolls, as ornaments. You will see that some ornaments are performed as double-stroke rolls, and in some contexts, like traditional rudimental drumming, there are advantages to conceptualizing the double-stroke roll as a rudiment. That being said, those concepts go beyond the scope of this course and would be more appropriately discussed with a more advanced student. For our discussion today, we'll consider the 4 categories of ornaments that I mentioned above and talk about their performance and usage. The shortest of the snare drum ornaments is called the flam. A flam consists of a single grace note placed just before a regular note. The following note is typically called the primary note or the main note. Here's one way that a flam can be notated. There are a few things to be aware of. First, the essential parts of a notated flam are the large primary note and the preceding smaller grace note. This is typical of all modern notated music, not just scores written for percussionists. Second, the markings around the 2 notes are not standardized. The way I have notated the flam below is the method that the Percussive Art Society uses on their list of rudiments, but you'll see all sorts of variations. The grace note may or may not have the slash on it. It may be written as a quarter note, 8th note, or 16th note, and the tie may or may not be present. Also, either note may have its stem flipped in either direction. That being said, all of these variations do not make a difference in the sound. Just be aware that you may run into flams that look a little different than the ones I've written here. To perform a flam, all that is required is a soft grace note followed by a louder primary note. To begin to practice this technique, I recommend that you start at the extremes with both notes, very loud and very soft. This may not be how all flams are performed in the context of real snare drum music, but it's the best way to begin to approach the technique. Start with the right stick up. Remember to bend from the wrist and not from the elbow. Then hold the left stick just above the drum head. From here, drop both sticks simultaneously. The lower stick will predictably strike first and more softly than the higher stick. Once both sticks have hit the drum head, lift the right hand back up to its starting position and repeat. One tendency for beginning percussionists is to use a prep stroke to move the grace note stick upwards before moving it downwards. This gives the stick performing the primary note time to catch up and sometimes will strike the drum even before the grace note stick. Be careful not to allow this to happen. Focus on the low height of the stick performing the grace note. As usual, once the right hand starts to feel comfortable, switch to the left. When we talk about sticking and flams, the hand that is mentioned or notated is the one that will perform the primary note. For example, we began with a right-handed flam, where the left stick performed the grace note just before the right hand played the primary note. When I say switch to the left hand, that means lift the left stick up so that the right stick will perform the grace note before the left hand strikes for the primary note. When performing alternating flams, the hand that is performing the grace note must prepare for the subsequent primary note by employing an upstroke. Consequently, the primary note hand must execute a downstroke to be ready for the softer following grace note. Let me demonstrate. I'll perform a right flam followed by a left flam. Focus on my right hand throughout. Notice how the stick stays low after the first flam to prepare for the second. Let me try again. This time, watch my left hand. You'll notice an upstroke followed by a downstroke. When alternating, this upstroke-downstroke motion allows us to perform consistent flams that maintain the disparity in volume between the grace notes and the primary notes. One last consideration with flams is the timing of the grace note. How open or closed should the flam be? This is definitely subjective. In some contexts, flams are performed slightly more open than in others. Ultimately, it's up to the performer to decide. For now, focus on keeping the grace note fairly tight to the primary note and as consistent as possible. As you become more comfortable, practice moving the grace note a little earlier or a little later. This will give you the flexibility that you need when you decide that a flam should be more open or closed. Here are some flams that I'd consider pretty open. And here are some flams that I'd consider pretty closed. In exercise 7.1, you can practice consecutive flams on each hand as well as alternating flams. Begin at an extremely slow tempo to develop the proper strokes and the placement of the grace notes. As you get more comfortable with exercise 7.1, move on to 7.2 and 7.3. These exercises walk through two of the most common flam rudiments, flam tap and flam accent. You will see how those are used in context through the following reading studies. The final flam exercise is 7.4. This exercise is nearly identical to exercise 4.3, accent grid. The only difference here is the addition of flams on each accent and note. Work slowly to be sure you're performing the notated sticking and all of the flams properly. The second of our ornaments for snare drum is the drag. The only difference here is that we now have two grace notes followed by a primary note instead of just one. The proper sticking to use is a double stroke followed by a loud tap. Here are a few right-handed drags. Notice how the double is kept low to the drum and the primary note dominates the sound. When teaching the drag, I find that students tend to want to play the double very wide most of the time using a wrist-wrist double stroke. The double here should definitely be on the closed end of the spectrum and is most effectively performed as a bounced double stroke. Notice the single wrist motion instead of two in the wrist-wrist stroke. That being said, there definitely should be some flexibility in performance, just as with the flam. To begin developing your drag, I find it helpful to compare and contrast it with the flam. Exercise 7.5 takes you through this process. The motion of the stick should be almost identical. Here are two flams and then two drags. Notice how the motion of my sticks is very similar in both instances. You almost shouldn't be able to tell the difference if the sound was muted and you just saw the motion of the sticks. Practicing in this way will counteract the tendency to perform the drag too open. The third ornament we will occasionally encounter is called the 4-stroke ruff. The number 4 designates how many sounds should be heard, 3 grace notes plus 1 primary note. 2 sticking options are commonly used here. First, simply alternating. Let me demonstrate slowly and then at full speed. Notice how the first 3 notes are softer than the last. The difficulty with the 4-stroke ruff is achieving this distinction in volume. This requires a quick lift of the stick that plays the second grace note and the primary note. Developing this control takes time and should be approached carefully. To execute this double, employ the drop squeeze technique with an exaggerated squeeze. The wrist must get involved a bit as well on the second sound if a large disparity is to be had. When the other 2 grace notes are reinserted, you end up with the 4-stroke ruff. A second common method for playing a 4-stroke ruff is to utilize a double stroke for the second and third grace notes. The sticking used here can either be right, left, left, right, or left, right, right, left. Let me demonstrate again slowly and then at full speed. The advantage to this sticking is that there's more time for the hand that performs the first and last notes to lift. Although this sticking allows for a greater difference in volume between the grace note and the primary note, there are definitely a few difficulties to consider. First, it's very easy to fall into the trap of performing the first grace note too loudly. Here's what I mean. It's also difficult to keep the grace notes closely attached to the primary note. Many times I hear students perform this sticking and they leave a gap between the third grace note and the primary note. Both of these problems need to be addressed for proper performance of the 4-stroke ruff. I would last like to quickly mention ornaments that are longer than 3 grace notes in length. Although you rarely encounter these ornaments, I believe that it's worth covering in this discussion. As long as there are no specific instructions from the composer, any ornament that you see with more than 3 grace notes is to be performed as a series of double strokes followed by a primary note. For example, a 4 grace note ornament should be performed with the sticking right, right, left, left, right, with the last right being the primary note. If you have an odd number of grace notes, just add a single at the front. With this formula and a little practice, you and your students will be able to execute any ornament that you encounter on the snare drum. To recap, flams are ornaments that have a single grace note followed by a primary note. Drags contain 2 grace notes, and the 4-stroke ruff contains 3. You'll most commonly encounter flams, followed occasionally by drags, and then by the 4-stroke ruff. The grace notes in each of these ornaments should sound softer than the primary note, and each should generally be performed closed. Remember, how open or closed an ornament is to be performed within reason can be left up to the performer. Make sure to begin your practice slowly and go through each exercise thoroughly before moving on to the reading studies. The sticking written below each ornament designates which hand performs the primary note. In the reading studies, you will encounter each of these ornaments in a number of different contexts. Good luck!